If the U.S. really was what it pretends to be. It's wild to consider how many of the world's problems would not exist if the U.S. really was the thing it advertises itself as. Ukraine would not be at war right now, because the U.S. empire would not have provoked that war, as the U.S. really would be an upholder of peace and international order. The world would not be staring down the barrel of nuclear Armageddon, because the U.S. would be a normal country that respects the sovereignty of other nations, instead of the hub of a globe-spanning, undeclared empire which keeps ramping up aggression against nuclear-armed states who refuse to consent to its planetary rule. China would not be preparing for war, because the U.S. military really would be used for the defense of the United States, instead of rapidly encircling the U.S. military's top geopolitical rival with massive amounts of war machinery. The Middle East would not have spent the 21st century being ripped to pieces by Western aggression, because the U.S. really would care about the lives of the people who live there, and not just pretend to in order to promote regime change interventionism. Mountains of human corpses would not have amassed in Yemen by violence, starvation, and disease, because the U.S. really would oppose tyrannical dictatorships like Saudi Arabia instead of enthusiastically facilitating their war crimes. The information ecosystem of the Western world would not be strangled by empire propaganda, internet censorship, and Silicon Valley algorithm manipulation, because the U.S. really would value free speech and free thought, instead of churning out a continual barrage of mass-scale psychological operations designed to dominate the way people think, speak, work, act, and vote. Julian Assange would not be languishing in prison, because the U.S. really would support press freedoms instead of working to set a legal precedent normalizing the persecution of journalists for reporting inconvenient facts. The people of the United States would not be floundering in poverty and broken infrastructure, because they really would live in a democracy that allows them to influence government policy instead of an oligarchy rigged to benefit the rich and powerful at the expense of normal human beings. The U.S. would not be a tyrannical police state with the largest incarceration rate on the planet, because the U.S. government really would care about civil rights and liberty instead of only caring about the profits that can be harvested via prison slavery and private prisons from those citizens who don't make good cogs in the capitalist machine. Developing nations would be thriving a lot more, because the U.S. really would support their national sovereignty and independence, instead of doing whatever's necessary to facilitate the imperialist extraction of their wealth. Human civilization would be far more just and equitable than it currently is, because the U.S. really would value every nation's right to forge its own path, and therefore would not have spent generations aggressively stomping out every attempt to move towards socialism everywhere in the world. The planet would not be circled by hundreds of foreign U.S. military bases and continually terrorized by U.S. wars of aggression, proxy conflicts, CIA coups, and starvation sanctions, because the U.S. government secrecy which makes such malfeasance possible wouldn't exist, since the U.S. really would value truth and transparency instead of power and domination. The world would be a much more healthy and harmonious place if the U.S. really was the peace-loving, tyranny-opposing democracy that it and all its propaganda systems frame it as. But because the U.S. government is actually the most tyrannical regime on Earth, and values nothing apart from its own ability to dominate as many members of the human species as possible, we live in a world of far greater peril and abuse than we otherwise would. I write so much about the U.S. empire because that's just what you find yourself doing when you set out to describe the problems of our world with an open mind. Trace those problems back to their origins, and many of them revolve around this strange and profoundly abusive structure which somehow manages to evade much criticism and scrutiny because it has the most sophisticated soft power narrative control systems ever devised. The U.S. empire depends on keeping the world asleep to its abusiveness, and the world depends on everyone waking up to it.